Hey everyone, Adriano Peta from the Geopolitica Mundial channel here, and if I ask you what is the most powerful force in geopolitics, what would you answer? Most likely if you follow the channel and actually know what geopolitics means, right? You won't forget the geo part, and you'll tell me that the most powerful force in geopolitics is geography. But it's not the only one, right? Because when it comes to human factors, what do you think is the most powerful force in the psyche, in the human mind, that can spread most efficiently among different peoples? What do you think it is? I'll tell you, it's the power of example. And this applies both at the individual level, among people, and even at the geopolitical level, among nations, empires, kingdoms, and so on. So, it's a very powerful force. Don't underestimate the power of example. And that's what we're going to see in today's video. But before that, guys, click the subscribe button here. If you're not subscribed, subscribe and share it with everyone you know. If you're already subscribed, do it to help the channel. Help Geopolitica Mundial keep going. It may not seem like it, but when you share, and most of you don't share, right? I see that, so share it. To make sure the Geopolitica Mundial channel stays alive, guys, it's important because YouTube practically buries this channel online. So your support is it's fundamental, it's also a very important force. So guys, that's it. My name is Leo Peta, and this is the Geopolitica Mundial channel. One thing that's often ignored in geopolitics, in politics, or even in international relations, whatever it may be, is the fundamental importance of example. People forget that governments, nations, parties, and groups are not intelligent entities in themselves, but rather the composition of individuals, where each one has their own psychology. This is no small thing, because basically that's what will determine what kind of response the group governing a country will give to a certain problem. Understand that in geopolitics, the most fundamental starting point is obviously geography. Many people criticize the geographic determinism of geopolitics. But that's the kind of person who, when reading a book, only gets to page 2 and ignores the other hundreds of pages just because they didn't like those first 2. That's also why it's so rare to find real geopolitical analysts, even though many people confuse international relations or political science analysts with geopolitical analysts. That's exactly why geopolitics starts with geographic analysis. It's the most basic, the primary element that a nation has. Geography dictates the resources that a civilization will have at its disposal and which ones it will have to seek, as well as what its priorities will be. There's no use complaining about it. Geography is the materialization of the power of the universe over individuals and over civilizations. It is the reality check that destroys ideologies and forces idealism to be humble. Using geography as an initial basis can sometimes lead a person to misunderstand reality, but ignoring geography will always lead to error. Fernand Braudel in 1949 proved this in the book The Mediterranean and the Mediterranean World in the Age of Philip II. That, to truly understand history, it is essential to look at the impacts of geography, demography, environmental and material issues, for example. Braudel points out that the fertile and abundant soils of the forested regions of Northern Europe made it possible for agricultural societies to be less dependent on large collective infrastructures, leading to freer and more dynamic social structures. Whereas in the Mediterranean, poorer soils in an unstable and dry climate forced the construction of complex irrigation systems, strengthening forms of oligarchic government. This poverty of Mediterranean soils and the continuous need for resources were reinforced. Crucial factors that motivated the ancient Greeks and Romans to seek expansion through military conquest, directly influencing the historical course of that region. And he was not the only one. Thomas Sowell shows the almost absolute weight of geography on the economy, and Jared Diamond shows the power of the environment over human evolution. Forget any analysis of world politics or geopolitics that does not use geography as the initial foundation of the analysis. However, geography, as I said, is initial, it is basic, it is fundamental, but it is not the only force acting on people. Culture, exchanges, trade, migrations, and other things also end up affecting civilizations and, as a consequence, the response that the elite of that civilization will give to the conditions that geography has given them. Which brings us back to psychology, because the psychology of individuals is influenced by their interaction with the community in which they live, which in turn will be influenced by culture. And culture literally determines the way you see and understand the universe. I've already made a video here on the channel talking about how different languages influence notions of time and interactions with different educational subjects. But the psychological aspect also has an effect on geopolitics, which cannot be underestimated. And that's because we humans, we are social animals, and as social creatures, we don't just learn from our own interaction with things, but also by observing other people's interactions with things. We humans, for obvious reasons, copy those behaviors that we see as successful, and we usually avoid those considered to be failures. And in this sense, the same applies to nations. In 1853, Japan was closed off to the world. It made a vital decision that would define not only its own future, but also that of part of humanity. The example of what happened to Imperial China during the Opium War made the Japanese realize that they could do nothing in the face of the industrial, military, and technological power of the West. Although they had been closed off for centuries, the Japanese were not blind to what was happening in the Asia-Pacific region. In addition to Japanese pirates who frequently brought information about what was happening to the shoguns, the Dutch, who were the only exception allowed to trade with the Japanese, also provided informational bulletins about what was happening. Japan then, instead of confronting the Americans head-on like China did. When a fleet from the United States arrived at the port of Nagasaki and threatened to bombard them if they didn't open the ports, they decided instead to soften the shock by opening trade with all Western countries at once, not just with the United States. Also, they made exclusive trade agreements with each country in different sectors, so that the interests of all the countries would end up being tied to those of the Japanese. It was a shame for Japan, but they had a long-term vision and understood that it was necessary to take one step back in order to take two steps forward. And seeing the need to modernize quickly, the Japanese then started the largest modernization project in history. They literally went from the Middle Ages to becoming an industrial and modern powerhouse. They went from the Middle Ages to the modern era. In just a few decades, they did in 40 years what other nations took more than 1,500 years to accomplish. They learned how to build industries from the Americans, learned how to build armies from the Prussians, and later from the Germans. They learned how to build a navy from the English and learned how to do modern science from the French. They chose the best examples. As a result, in just 52 years, the Japanese went from being a feudal country, after being forced to open their ports to a foreign nation, to start and win a war against a European empire that was considered a major power at the time. China's failed behavior with the West served as an example for the Japanese to do the opposite, and the successful examples of several Western countries also served as a positive example for the Japanese to assimilate. What needed to be assimilated? But then, here we come to a complicated and more recent point. If we look at the 80s and 90s, the United States was a global model of success, whether artistically, economically, militarily, or politically, they set the standard. Of course, there will be anti-Americans trying to find fault, but the fact is, as the United States' rival nation, the Soviet Union, was declining and collapsing, it became clear that the United States, even though they had many flaws, and really many, were the most successful model. The Americans managed the feat of associating the most efficient economic model with a morally superior image. They represented the image of freedom, human values, hard work, justice, free market, freedom of speech, and democratic values, in a society that, even though it was unjust, managed to be one of the least unjust in the world. And of course, not all of this would necessarily be true. There's no need to freak out and start writing something right away. Relax, because that's not the point. The point is that there was an association of the American image with these values. Whether that was true or not doesn't matter. What matters is that this association existed. In the 80s and 90s, they were a reference point. Whether you liked them or not, psychologically, they were associated with that. The land of the free. And again, it doesn't matter if it's true or false. or if it's an exaggeration. What matters is that there was this association. I want you to understand that.
And as always happens with exaggerations,
there was some basis in reality if we compare it with other historical regimes, especially with the obscurantism and harmful socialism of the Soviet Union and Maoist China. The United States represented by far a better economy and a better society. It's no wonder that, with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early years, Russians started embracing American cultural aspects after suffering for decades from the socialist disease. Both Russians and other Eastern European peoples rushed to embrace the United States. Today, knowing the experience of socialism and knowing capitalism and especially American culture, they don't even want to hear about going back to what the former Soviet Union was. Because the big factor here is that, again, it wasn't just the victory of a better economic system, but also, supposedly, of a superior morality. No one in Eastern Europe wanted to return to the hardships of socialism, not even most Russians, and the vast majority still don't. It's because of this economic and moral success, and that they would be copied by other nations around the world, because again, we are social animals, and we copy what we see as successful. And what about the Gulf War? When Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait, the American intervention was strategically perfect in every aspect. Few wars can be studied as examples of such success because everything was properly coordinated. It was a military operation to liberate a country that had been illegally invaded with broad support from the United Nations. Several other countries would also send military forces to help in Operation Desert Storm. And those who didn't send soldiers would send money to finance the Allies, which made the war much cheaper for the United States. It had a tangible and realistic objective, which was to defeat Saddam Hussein in Kuwait, breaking his war machine and taking away the Iraqis' ability to attack another country again, and add to that political and economic context. The issue of the technology the Americans displayed against the Iraqis made American superiority clear, with new technologies and Iraqi organization. The United States, in 100 hours, broke the backbone of the Iraqi army, which at the time was the third largest in the world. And this with very few American and Allied casualties, with Kuwait liberated and at minimal cost and few civilian casualties. The bombings in Iraq ushered in the era of surgical strikes, where collateral damage to civilians was intended to be as minimal as possible. No massive bombings like in World War II or Vietnam, which devastated the city. Now, precision minimized civilian suffering. Of course, compared to previous wars, they were the world's police, arbitrating negotiations and diplomatically interacting with all countries in an attempt to build a new world order now aimed at a more liberal world. So, it's obvious that they would be a model of success. Everyone would try to copy them in some way or in some area, if not in everything, then in the economy, or in the military field, or in the area of research. In fact, China itself tried to copy many things from the United States, and there's nothing wrong with that. Because remember, humans copy behaviors that are considered successful, and the same applies to nations. What's normal for us humans is to copy actions that are considered successful, not to just magically come up with them out of thin air. Of course, behind the scenes, everything was still very difficult. Things were ugly in American politics, with scandals running rampant, with massacres, embargoes, and sanctions that led millions of people to starvation in Iraq. So, obviously, I don't mean to say that everything was perfect, because that would be impossible in the world we live in. But even with all these caveats, there was this symbolism surrounding the United States that positively influenced many countries around the world. Of course, a big part of this positive image is due to the propaganda made by Hollywood. But if it were just propaganda and didn't have some basis in truth, this association wouldn't take hold so automatically. If there was ever a moment in human history when a nation could conquer the whole world, that moment was the 1990s. The United States had the most powerful force on the planet, which was the power of example. Nothing influences and dictates human behavior more than example. But then came September 11, 2001, and the United States was hit hard. Not only were the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, which were powerful symbols of the American war machine and economy, hit. But above all, Americans felt fear, fear that evolved into paranoia, and paranoia that evolved into hatred. In the days following September 11, the United States presented the plan to invade Afghanistan at the UN. And although it was not explicitly ordered by a specific Security Council resolution, it was widely seen as a legitimate act of self-defense. Under the UN Charter, and in the view of most countries, almost every country in the world supported the invasion. After all, no one looked favorably upon Islamic extremists targeting civilians. And here was the last opportunity for the United States, in a certain sense, although not literally, to dominate the world. Because not only were they the successful example of the things I mentioned, but now they also had the moral appeal of having been victims of extremism. And almost a blank check to be able to do anything. Roughly speaking, in a very general way, the world was deeply moved and sympathetic to the Americans, even their rivals and most of their enemies. And, well, what did the Americans do with that blank check? They used that to justify the invasion of Iraq. What Bush Sr. couldn't do due to legal and political restrictions more than 10 years earlier during the Gulf War, Bush Jr. was now going to do. The sensitive, paranoid, and frightened American population, scared by Islamic extremism, believed and supported the invasion, which was based on absurd claims like Iraq developing weapons of mass destruction and harboring and protecting members of Al-Qaeda. Globally, Americans went from being seen as victims to being viewed as belligerent, militaristic, and aggressive. Few countries supported the United States invasion of Iraq, something completely opposite to what was seen in Afghanistan and in the United Nations Security Council. France, Russia, and China promised to veto any proposal for intervention in Iraq at the UN Assembly. The vast majority of nations opposed the invasion, since it didn't make any sense at all. So, what did the United States do, knowing that they couldn't invade Iraq legally or with political support? They invaded anyway, disregarding international law, using completely subjective arguments for a preemptive attack. Basically, using this thesis, one country attacks another because in the future it suspects that the other will attack it. You only need a 2-digit IQ to realize the problem with this subjectivity. But, despite the invasion of Iraq, nothing happened at the state level. In retaliation against the United States, there was nothing more than statements of condemnation. And it was no wonder, no one in 2003 could remotely compare to the military strength of the United States. And economically, they were the main partner of most countries in the world. They were the only major engine of global trade, with deep ties to all countries. No one could oppose the United States militarily, or even sanction them economically, because that would lead the economy of any country that tried it to ruin. Notice that the country with the image of being a defender of international law, guarantees of sovereignty and freedom, was disregarding everything it had preached. Ignoring the position of other nations, it invaded another country that hadn't attacked them and went unpunished. This is what you need to pay attention to. This dangerous precedent is what was set, and that's what we need to look at. The message that was given was clear. And the message that many countries understood was that if you are militarily capable of devastating another country, especially if you have nuclear weapons, and if you are excessively tied to trade with other countries economically, then you can invade other countries and get away with it. Because all they will do is sue statements of condemnation and not take concrete actions, because again, humans are social animals who copy behaviors considered successful, even if they are immoral. Whether the invasion of Iraq was a fiasco or not, that's not the point. This happened for military reasons, because from a political point of view the United States was successful. They invaded another country and got away with it. Internationally, those were the precedents, and in geopolitics, precedents are fundamental. Because this will greatly influence the psychology of other countries in deciding whether or not to copy that country's actions. That same power of example I mentioned was what Russia used in 2022 to attack Ukraine. They suspected that the Ukrainians would join NATO and that in the future they would attack Russia. So, why not a preemptive strike? Israel in 2025. They suspected that Iran might be developing nuclear weapons and suspected that they could maybe be used against Israel. So, why not also carry out a preemptive strike, even if other countries oppose your invasion? You only need two things militarily to be able to retaliate devastatingly against anyone who attacks you. And economically, to have an economy so tied to other countries that if they risk sanctioning you, they end up putting their own economy in danger. The point I want to make is that this isn't something aimed at most people, because this channel has never focused on reaching the majority of people. The thing is, it doesn't matter if it was fair or unfair, if it was justifiable or not, if it was right or wrong, if it was true or a lie. Unfortunately, these aren't the forces that drive and motivate humans and nations. It's the example of what has been successful. Success, not the narrative, is what convinces people the most. So, if Russia or Israel or any country decides to invade another, the morality of the act, your support, even the truth, don't matter. I'm sorry, because what will make other nations behave in way A or B will be whatever is seen as a reference for success. The United States lost in 2003 its historic opportunity to use the public reaction and the power of example to probably become the most influential nation in history. The nation would probably be culturally dominant, not in a symmetrical sense, not in the sense of traditional conquest, but in the sense of having created a world order that reflected its original values, which were established back then by its founding fathers. And in fact, they ended up opening a Pandora's box that led other countries to behave in the same immoral way. This is the point that most analysts you will see or have seen won't point out to you. The fundamental aspect of the power of example in geopolitics and in history. And that's it, folks. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked it, as I said at the beginning of the video, share it with everyone to give us that support and strength so I can keep bringing this kind of content to you. And if you really like the channel, consider becoming a member. Depending on the category you choose, your name will appear here in the end credits. You make sure that Geopolitica Mundial keeps existing, and you'll get access to exclusive content that's even more specific and detailed for you. We have the series on the geopolitics of the Mongol Empire, the geopolitical history of the United States, and the military history of China. We offer many exclusive topics for members, helping ensure the Geopolitica Mundial channel continues. Since, as I said, YouTube practically hides this channel, so by becoming a member, you ensure the existence of this channel, and of course, I'm very grateful. So guys, that's all. Thank you very much, and see you in the next video.